this is not exactly a good week that George Bush would want to put into his daily diary. The economy remains very flat. There is that big flap over the Civil Rights Bill, and Andrea Mitchell, our chief congressional correspondent from Tim Russert, our Washington bureau chief at NBC News, are with us to talk about it this morning. Good morning. Is the president's problem just really a bad economy? If it weren't there, he'd be fine.
That's a big part of the problem, but I've got to tell you, this Johnson thing has got to be resolved. Yesterday morning, the front pages of both major newspapers that are read here in Washington, the Post and the New York Times, had John Sununu blaming his boss. When was the last time you had a chief of staff blaming the president for what went wrong on a variety of things, particularly the credit card cap? I've got to tell you that this reminds me a lot of the Donald Reagan mess. And, you know, the primary role of a chief of staff is to deflect criticism from his boss. I'd like to sort of wonder, where is Nancy Reagan when we need her? Somebody's got to pull the plug on this, and fast.
Tim, do you agree?
Bring back Nancy Reagan?
No, I don't know. Well, how serious is the problem? I mean, we shouldn't laugh about it, because it is a serious problem in the White House that you have, to use that cliche word, the disarray there, the president off balance. What does George do about whether it's John Sununu or getting the act together?
Well, there's something about George Bush. I never underestimate him. Whenever he's had to make a big decision or stand up to a crisis, whether it was the speech of his life at the convention in '88 or breaking his tax pledge or the Persian Gulf War, he has done it. And I expect the president in the next week or so perhaps create a new campaign structure which will be superimposed over Sununu, or somehow work around this problem. But I think you'll see something done in relatively soon.
You think that we will see John Sununu out of the committee to re-elect the president?
I'm not sure what form it will take, but I think this president, when it comes to these kinds of things, will be very decisive.
Okay, let's talk about these policy shifts that we've seen in the last week on affirmative action, on the abortion counseling gag rule, on his trip to Asia, which has now been reinstated. Who is in charge?
Well, George Bush is in charge, and that's one thing we should not forget, that this is what George Bush's White House wants to be done. If we're going to give him all the credit on foreign policy for running a very effective foreign policy, I think that people are going to start to blame George Bush for running an ineffective domestic policy. Perhaps he is correct on his economic notion that doing nothing might be the best thing right now, but he is not projecting the kind of leadership that people want. And now you've got the House Republicans going off in one direction, wanting a tax package, wanting Jack Kemp to be in charge.
It's a very important point that Andrea raises. This is not just a partisan matter, Garrick, or Mary Alice. 83 Republicans wrote the president a letter, Republicans, and said, hey, would you appoint Jack Kemp your domestic policy czar?
All right,
Get control of this.
So the president now realizes elections coming up, you have to have this domestic agenda. The voters, the people are demanding it. One report this morning talks about a Pentagon study for even further defense military spending cuts, perhaps up to $50 billion. That means Bush is at least entertaining the idea of making a dramatic new departure in this direction.
He has to get out front of that issue. The world has changed. The American public knows it. Defense spending is going to go down. And the president would prefer to have it go down, according to his blueprint, rather than the congressional Democrats.
Let me just add a note of caution here. This weekend we've seen a debacle on Capitol Hill over defense spending when Sam Nunn, the Armed Services Chairman, had to get up and say he was going to vote against the defense bill yesterday because so much pork had been added into it. Military museums around the country. When we're about to lay off people who fought and could have given up their lives in Desert Storm, and we're going to build military museums in New Orleans. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace, and Nunn is right about it. And I think the Pentagon can talk about cutting defense spending, but Congress seems to keep tacking stuff on for their districts.
This is all election year work, including the Republican letter to President Bush. They're covering their own hides going into the election.
Well, I think Congress realizes that it just can't be George Bush's recession. The American people are going to say, wait a minute, Washington's accountable for this, and you're part of Washington. Do something.
Well, I want to pick up the fact that there's a lot of anger in this country directed towards government. There's a lot of anger in the Capitol, but I even detect from you, and particularly you, Andrea, there's a good bit of anger among journalists who cover it.
Well, anger and frustration that the Congress and the White House don't seem to have any way of doing something together, that government is dysfunctional. And I think that after a while, we experience the same thing that the rest of the American public experiences, that nothing is accomplished, that they are at cross purposes.
And now the members of Congress can go home during the holidays and see what the voters have to say to them.
It won't be pleasant, Gary.
Pleasant. All right, Andrea.
It'll be rain.
Tim, thanks for being with us this morning.
And next up on Sunday Today, politics on a small and essentially human scale. We'll focus on migrant workers. Elsewhere, their exploitation is renowned. in our town, their dignity is what drives the community.